but I think we should just get going. So welcome to the first session of the afternoon. This one's called Gen Z, How to be a Dissenter. It's a partnership with Living Freedom, which is an initiative organised by Ideas Matter, the educational charity, and it's an initiative that aims to get young people thinking about freedom and free speech, and it runs summer schools and various different events. And if you want to find out more about Living Freedom, then you can go to the website livingfreedom.org.uk, or you can ask a number of the people in this room who've all been to the things like the summer school that we run and the various different events that we do. I'm Alastair, by the way. I'm the one of the conveners of Battle of Ideas Festival, but I also do have a role in organising Living Freedom. So, Gen Z and dissenting. We live in a world that's increasingly conformist and where it's difficult to dissent from a prevailing opinion. It's a fairly commonly held view. You get all these surveys these days in universities that constantly report on how difficult it is to speak against gender ideology or climate change or Black Lives Matter or the kind of Israel's role in the war in Gaza. Everybody reports it being very difficult to speak up, offer differing opinions, and the result is that people self-censor. Or is that really the way of the world? I mean, others would say that there's many people who are angry about all sorts of different things, never shy of sounding off. There's thriving subcultures, whether online or offline. Transgression is usually these days worn as a badge of honour amongst lots of young people. And political taboos are being busted, let's face it. I mean, something like the number of young people who voted for the Reform Party and for populist parties, both in the UK and Europe, is in many ways quite astonishing and goes against the grain of what we've been told for the last few years about young people being able to think differently. So I think we need to kind of ask, are we really living in conformist times? Are we actually perfectly able to dissent if we choose to? Is there a danger that dissenters simply form their own little cliques and echo chambers of fellow dissenters, all who think the same thing, and they're not really actually dissenting against anything very much in that sense? It begs the question, what does it mean to be a dissenter? What's the difference between dissenting, for example, and being a contrarian? What are the differences between those two? Are we self-censoring, or are we actually just opting out, copping out even, of having an argument with other people? And how do we best make the case for speaking our minds? So that's some of the things that we want to look at in this session. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order that they're going to speak in. So first of all, in the middle of a very crowded panel behind the table, let's face it, is Samuel Rubinstein, who's a postgraduate historian and writer. He's currently at Oxford undertaking a PhD on 19th century German intellectual history, and you can read lots of his often very interesting articles, I think, on various outlets like The Spectator and Unheard. Next, we'll hear from Vinay Kapoor, who's next to Sam. He's a politics student at University of Warwick. He's president of the Warwick Speakeasy, which is a free speech society that encourages open debate and dialogue. And he also works sometimes for the Free Speech Union, where he runs a programme called the McTaggart Programme. If you're interested in organising events, you can go to Vinny and possibly get a grant to help you do that. Third, we'll hear from, on the other side of Sam, I'm using Sam as the anchor in this introduction. On the other side of Sam is Tyler Robinson. He's an independent researcher based in the Northwest who writes about social theory, heterodox political economy and intellectual history, and he's got a particular interest in exploring alternative frameworks in political economy and sociology. Welcome to you, Tyler. Right next to me, we've got Emma Gilland, politics undergraduate at University of Birmingham, co-author of The Corona Generation, Coming of Age in a Crisis. She's written for outlets like Spiked and for the Equiano Project, who are an organisation that are here at the festival. And she's also the editor of Red Brick, which is the University of Birmingham's student publication. Finally, far right, Ralph Leonard, always gets the far right comment because he's a leftist and makes that point in his biography. Likes to uphold the legacy of the Enlightenment, which is possibly something for a rarity of leftists these days. He's the author of a letter on liberty called Unshackling Intimacy, which you can get at the bookshop, and he's a contributor also to numerous publications, but Unheard and Quillette and The New Statesman and others. So, give them a big welcome. So I've given them about 5 or 6 minutes just to make some opening remarks, then we're going to come straight out to you for your thoughts, points, questions, whatever it is that you want, and get a bit back and to and fro going in terms of questions and responses. So, Sam.
Thank you very much, Alastair. I'm especially heartened to hear you refer to it as Gen Z, which is a rare thing in Britain where seemingly lots of people prefer Gen Z. So
I refuse to be memified.
So I will try to adopt your usage. On the subject of memes, I think it says a lot about my internet poisoned mind that the first thing I thought of, and the first thing I ever think of when I hear the word dissent now, is a meme. It's a meme I'm sure many of you have seen before, and fortunately it is also a legitimate and influential piece of art. It's the famous painting by Norman Rockwell, 1943, which depicts, the title of the painting is Freedom of Speech, and it's part of a series obviously produced during the Second World War. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It shows a man with a sort of tweed shirt and a jacket sort of undone almost all the way, standing up at a sort of town meeting, and people around him sort of look awed, and some of them even slightly horrified, because he's clearly going against the grain. He's clearly a dissenter. Now, I have seen this image probably thousands of times. It's usually used on Twitter when people want to put out a controversial opinion that they think they're going to be sort of attacked over. But until very recently, I didn't know what the painting actually depicts. Who is this man? What is the town hall? So bizarrely, it's not the most glamorous event. It's a normal town hall meeting. The local school has just burned down. Understandably, most of the residents of the town, this is Arlington, most of the residents of Arlington want to rebuild the school. And so they're moving towards unanimous agreement. And this one man gets up to say, well, I don't think we should rebuild the school because that will cost money and I don't want to be taxed for it, in effect. What I'm trying to say is it's something mundane, and actually he's dissenting on something where I think many of us would probably take the majority view that maybe it is a good thing if the school has burned down to rebuild it. And even then, it's a powerful piece of art, and it's been a successful meme because there was something attractive, there was something glamorous about the dissenter, about being the lone voice going against the grain, even over something mundane, even over something unpopular. And that's precisely, I think, the point. We are attracted to the idea of dissent, and I think young people especially are attracted to the idea of dissent, even when they're not willing to dissent themselves. Is it more difficult to dissent now than it used to be? I think this is a tricky question to address. Of course, on one level, literally, no, it's not. We have extraordinary freedoms in 21st century Britain to say what we like. Social media gives us the opportunity to express ourselves in all sorts of ways. It gives us the opportunity, if we wish, to dissent in the public sphere, which would have been very tricky to do before the advent of social media. Although I certainly think Britain can go a lot further in protecting freedom of speech in all sorts of ways. By and large, we are able to disagree with the government of the day on most political issues. We are able to go against the grain of popular opinion, usually, if we're brave enough. But I think the point about bravery is the fundamental one. Why does it feel often harder to dissent now than it perhaps used to be, or than it might be in other countries? And I think it is related to a sort of general crisis of courage in public life. I think we have fewer examples of people like the man in the Norman Rockwell painting who possess the courage to dissent. I think this is something we can perceive in all aspects of life. Our university professors certainly are less able or less willing to dissent than they used to be. I have lost track of the number of times I've been talking to academics who will say, well, of course I don't believe in this or that, or of course I think this is nonsense, but I don't want to speak about this publicly, and I always want to sort of shake them by the shoulders and sort of say, well, if you don't do this, who will? I want, in other words, to call them a coward, and I think that this may be a just and valid reaction. But of course, we can also sympathise with people in this position. Likewise, we don't usually expect courage from our politicians anymore. A few months ago, there was a scandal that's now sort of long since forgotten the way these things are, when the Speaker of the House, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, changed the order of motion and engaged in all sorts of parliamentary manoeuvrings, in effect to ensure that Labour wouldn't have to vote a certain way on a motion pertaining to Israel and Palestine, because Labour MPs had written to him saying that they were concerned about threats to their safety. Now, on the one hand, I can sympathise with Lindsay Hoyle for doing this. It's admirable and virtuous that he would choose to protect the safety of parliamentarians. But on the other hand, I can't help but think of, say, the 94 socialist or social democratic deputies in Germany in 1934 who voted against the Enabling Act, knowing that doing so was something that would, in some cases, risk death and certainly risk serious persecution. Because we live in safe and happy times, we don't expect the courage from authority figures that I think once would have been something we could have expected. And that does mean that if you're a young person, it is harder to dissent, it is harder to know that you will be backed up by the authorities. And it is harder, be they teachers or parents or academics or politicians, and it's harder to internalise the idea that dissent is not only something we valorise in theory, but something that we can actually do in practice. So I suppose the point I really want to underscore here is dissent is powerful, it is attractive, precisely because it requires courage and precisely because it involves incurring a risk. It is precisely because in dissenting you might lose friends and make enemies, you might make your own life more difficult and miserable. Therein lies its value. But history is full of examples of people who have had the courage to do so, often under far more extreme and perilous circumstances than our own. And the first step, I think, of how to be a dissenter as a young person in the 21st century is to take stock from their examples.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent start, Sam. So, Vinay, your thoughts, please.
Sure, well, thank you, and it's really great to be here and to be with a very intelligent panel of dissenters. I want to talk and use the 5 minutes I have to talk about my experience both studying at Warwick, being a university student, but also from a kind of free speech point of view, working also part-time for the Free Speech Union. What I want to talk about is two things. First, I want to talk about politics and friendship and this kind of nitty sort of hellish relationship that these two things have. And then finally talk about maybe something akin to a solution, or at least an attempt at one. So the first thing I want to say is, I don't think universities are as bad necessarily as it's kind of made out in this space. You hear phrases like, oh my God, the woke cancel culture in universities, no one's being educated anymore. But given my experience, things aren't necessarily that bad. However, there really is a point, and this was made in the blurb, about politics and friendship. Now, I would argue that usually the former should, politics and friendship, so the friendship should transcend politics. But what's happening now in the current age that we're in is we're seeing the other way around. We're seeing politics transcending friendship, assuming I got the order the right way around. And I personally haven't had this problem, but I know a lot of people doing it. And as Sam said, we don't want to say things that kind of offend other people. We're groupish creatures. We like people pleasing. And therefore, in the current age that we live in of Gaza and trans and everything else, dissent, challenging, disagreeing is actually really difficult. So I've seen this personally with Israel-Palestine. So I have friends who are not even taking sides, but have been cancelled by their own friends because they're not failing to criticize Israel. Same thing with an event I organised last year at my university with Nina Power, who's actually here today and just spoke an hour ago. I invited her to talk about young men and young women, not in any trans context, but just about masculinity, about feminism, because I think these are really important discussions. But as some of you might know, Nina was also a gender critical feminist, which at a university is like a recipe for hell and disorder. And one of my friends said to me a few weeks ago, Vinay, we don't have enough women in the society. So me being me, I thought, okay, well, let's just invite a feminist then. It turns out we invited the wrong kind of feminist. And again, that kind of prompts pushback, right? I was like, well, we've got a feminist. And this person put on their Instagram story, oh, I'm so excited about this event. And I was like, okay, you probably will regret saying that later on. And their friends went, oh, this is the wrong kind of feminist. So again, we're kind of parroted and sort of kind of captured by groupthink. And I see this a lot in relation to Gaza. So, and I really think this is a real shame, because in life, our relationships, who we are as people should transcend our politics. Yet in the polarizing era we're in, we're not seeing that. And that's something I think is a real big problem. So that's food for thought. And obviously we can debate that. Now, ideally, I wish the solution were legislative. And it's funny because I'm not actually a fan of top-down stuff. But the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill that the Free Speech Union, who I work for, worked very hard to get passed, as a lot of you are aware, has kind of been paused by a click of a finger and is probably going to be eliminated, which is really a shame, because the whole point of that bill was to kind of encourage a culture of free speech on campus, which I really think is lacking. Okay, so we have this problem. We have this problem of, assuming it's a problem, I think it is, of politics and friendship. We have a problem of the fact that the current government aren't really doing anything about it. Again, the reason why they want to pause the bill is because they don't want to harm marginalized groups. Again, the same kind of critical theory arguments about hate speech kind of creeping in, which again, obviously we can debate those. I just don't think those are useful for protecting freedom of speech. So what do we do? And I'll use this as an excuse to plug two things that I'm doing, not for selfish means, but maybe hopefully to show that something can be done if you really want to do something about it. So other than joining Living Freedom, which you should all do, even though I was not paid to say this, Living Freedom are absolutely incredible. If you're young, if you're under 30, you must join. Like, I've met all these people here, some of the people in the audience, seriously incredible people who are real dissenters and really interesting and really open to debate. So join that. But the other thing I would say is do something about it, right? So I'm very lucky. I go to a very good university. I've met some incredible people, some very intelligent people. And therefore, I thought, okay, well, if we got all these people in the same room, we might actually learn something from each other. So I decided to set up my own free speech society. We host debates, we host discussions with speakers. Some of them are here this weekend. And I think that helps satisfy the void, because our role is not to kind of kick back against the woke cancel culturing mob that's on campus. I don't really care about that, right? I think they're a tyranny of a vocal minority. But I think that at least helps satisfy the void. If we just do one thing, if someone tells their truth, if someone challenges the speaker or learn, then my job is simply done. So we have to show that debate, discussion is normal, and that's the one big thing we're trying to do. And the last thing is, from a Free Speech Union point of view, is funding, money, because a lot of grassroots initiatives don't have funding and don't have money. So as Alastair kind of hinted at, we run an initiative called the Ian McTaggart Fund, which is a funding program for young people. We offer grants to young people interested in free speech on campus. We've supported established debating societies, new debating societies growing in numbers, and also individual projects, some of whom are even in the room today. So go talk to them and they can tell you how good it is. But from a serious point of view, what this does is it again is helping to change the culture and showing these things are normal. So obviously we're in a tough position, we're in a tough predicament, and I think I would certainly accept that. But there's something we can do. We have agency, we have the free will, we have the ability to do something different. And even if, because I really believe, and this is what I'll close on, I really believe that in this situation, this problem that we face, there's a tyranny of a vocal minority to kind of appropriate JS Mill and kind of turn it on its head. But beneath that, there is the silent majority. I've spoken to a lot of people, and that doesn't mean they exist, but they do, right? Who want to debate, who want to discuss, but are scared. And all it takes is courage, as Sam said. All it takes is telling the truth and speaking the truth. And maybe they might come out the shadows. And I don't know, maybe it will make your life a bit better. So we have responsibility as Gen Z, and others to take control, to take initiative and use our agency. So I think there is a cause for some optimism, although you can all dissent and tell me how wrong that is in a bit. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Vinay. Tyler.
Yeah, thank you, Alastair. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So firstly, I should note that I'm speaking purely in a personal capacity. So all opinions expressed are my own, so do feel free to harangue me at the end. Do take the gloves off. So who then are Gen Z? So Generation Z, or Z, as Alastair puts it, are people born between 1997 and 2017. This is the generation that followed Gen Y, or millennials, the previous bugbear of legacy media. So to put it simply, Gen X are the children of baby boomers, Gen Y are people who grew up with the internet and remember 9/11, and Gen Z, that we're discussing today, grew up with smartphones and Instagram. So the concept of a generation is basically innate. We needn't troll through the literature for any depth. And throughout history, generations have always basically looked up at their elders with reverence and below at their juniors with jealousy and dismissal. Aristotle condemned the high-minded youth who hadn't been humbled yet by life in his rhetoric. Horace complained that the generation was worse than his grandparents' generation and would in turn bequeath a generation even more corrupt. And back in the 1960s, William F. Buckley remarked on the listlessness of the youth generation who got their kicks by attaching themselves to ideals which were self-condemned and narcissistic. Sound familiar? History may not repeat itself exactly, but it sure does rhyme. So what makes Gen Z unique then? Well, I'll list some points courtesy of the Daily Mail. They can't afford to buy a home due to excessive coffee and avocado consumption. They are the most anxious generation, the rudest generation, the most frugal generation. They terrify their bosses with woke demands. They have less sex than previous generations, but are more likely to get sexually transmitted diseases. Not sure how that went. And most famously, they cannot watch Netflix without the subtitles on. So being on this panel, I should note that despite my dishevelled appearance, I am actually a member of this very joyless generation, and I agree that all of the above are 100% true. Obviously I'm joking, but a lot of the opprobrium sent at Generation Z, my generation, our generation, contains elements of truth and exaggeration. The reason for those historical examples is because we see these things cycle. It's repeated over and over again. The youth are lazier, the old generation was smarter, better, stronger, more resilient. And the thing you'll have noticed is that none of the aforementioned headlines attack Gen Z for rebelling or dissenting. If they are dissenting, it seems to be against fun and in favour of safety, isolation, and austere living. If that's the case, can we call this dissent? The request for safe spaces, vulnerability, embracing the status quo doesn't seem particularly rebellious to me. This turning inwards and away from challenge is in a sense much easier for our generation than it was for previous generations. Working from home, only engaging with niche communities online that agree with your opinions, staying inside, rejecting the social world, and amusing ourselves to death, as Neil Postman would put it, is much easier than it was for our parents. The comfort of the familiar makes dissent quite unattractive. However, publishing dissenting views, finding like-minded comrades and friends, and building your intellectual foundation is now much easier than it was for previous generations. Now, you can find a group that will dissent against anything, however wise or ill-informed, online. Who then are the rebels of Gen Z? Is it the Gen Z left, whose utopian demands and lack of strategy lead them to substitute the working class, whatever the current fad is this week? Or is it the Gen Z right, who occupy an increasingly cliche anti-woke shtick, where opposition to prevailing sensitivities borders on childish contrarianism? I'll be honest, I'm not completely sure. I think much of what is called dissent isn't because the system absorbs so much of it. Anti-capitalist memes feed capitalistic algorithms. Lifestyleism doesn't change mainstream society, it simply creates a new identity to be marketed towards. Personally, I think dissent means opposing the grey conformity that pervades society, rejecting those fads and conventions which prevent us from expressing our true highest forms and having the bravery to swim against the tide whilst doing so. So how then should Gen Z dissent? I think firstly we need to understand the context that we live in. What's the dialectic that we inhabit? To change the world, we have to understand it first. Where are the balances of power? What are we dissenting against? How? Why? To do this, I think Gen Z need to gather the intellectual resources to understand the world. You need to know your opponent's arguments inside and out so that you can trounce them in the battle of ideas. Convincing people of the rightness of your argument is difficult, but once you do it, you'll have the confidence to dissent. And finally, Gen Z need to transcend the concept of a generation. There is no generational standpoint. Personally, I think this idea is rooted in the 60s hippie or yippie movement that said, don't listen to anyone over 27. The implication was that the youth hadn't embraced the ossified ideologies of the old. They had much more to win and much less to lose. However, it's rarely pointed out that these were the words of Jerry Rubin, a man who was well into his 30s with children, a doting wife, and later in life a very successful career in investment banking. This kind of youthful arrogance, which dismisses the value of older generations, isn't particularly helpful. If you're going to dissent, do it around something coherent and meaningful. Being born at a certain time of history isn't sufficient. We're dissenting here, we're not discussing horoscopes.
Thank you very much. Lots of interesting points. I thought it was me that only me that watched Netflix with subtitles. So I'm kind of relieved to know it goes wider than that. Emma.
So I seem to have gone down a kind of different track with this. So I'm hoping that everyone can ask me questions of why I decided to go down this route. I wanted to look at the perceptions of Gen Z in relation more to protest as dissent, because over the last, I would say, 10 years maybe, it's not that Gen Z or Gen Z are having no protests, but maybe it's that we're seeing them as having the wrong kind of protests. However, I want to kind of make the argument that the protests of Gen Z run along the same themes and demands as many of the protests that came previously from previous generations. However, I want to argue that the socio-economic conditions that have shaped these demands and what Gen Z are fighting for has changed. And so I am going to explain this in both the sense of the changing nature of the economy, hence why Generation Z want more security from their protests, and how the change in the political space in the last 10, 15 years have changed how Generation Z see their capacity to fight for agency in political change. So I wanted to just have a quick look at the protests of 1968, as I think this is one of the big changing points in political agency, as it was the first kind of globalized political change with what was known at the time, or theorized slightly later, as the diffusion effect, where the protests were going beyond the individual governments and going kind of across the globe. And I wanted to highlight these protests in 1968 because there was varying demands. Across America, there was the civil rights movement and the student protests for changing the curriculum. In the UK and France, there were protests against universities and university expansion. In Eastern Europe, there were protests against censorship and changing academic practices. There were protests against nuclear weapons and protests against the Vietnam War. And why I bring this up is because the themes identified for the political change in these protests were war, environmental change, and racial relations. And of course, changes in university space. This, I argue, is the same as many of the protests that have come in recent years. And so, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests, the walkouts for the climate against the environment, and the Israel-Palestine protests. However, what we're seeing here is that these protests are not necessarily seen in the same light. They're not seen as kind of liberating as they may have been before. And I don't disagree that there are differences here, I want to argue that the differences are that because Gen Z have a different idea of where power lies and accountability. Because I think the protests in 1968 were very much directed against the government and they saw it as a way to they were quite hopeful of political change. However, Gen Z are not seen as doing this. Their protests are often belittled and kind of pushed down and not actually being able to increase political liberation for their generation, but actually decreasing it. The protests are often said to be moving online and focusing much more on individuals than the government. This was labelled as the boycott generation, in the fact that they're actually losing the capability to kind of do something as a big collective action and instead focusing on their own individual behaviour. And while I do agree that this can be seen as maybe cowardice or not quite as brave, I actually can see why they have tried to make this change. The boycott generation have realised that the power no longer lies so clearly with the government, but instead of the companies and the different institutions which it has been diffused. This is similar with the recent protests about Israel-Palestine in universities. What I noticed was it wasn't actually so much directed at trying to change foreign policy from the government as the protests were in 1968, but instead it was blaming the university for their institutional role in funding the war. And so this, I think, is not the fault of Generation Z, but the fault of the governments that came before them. They depoliticise many issues and they have relinquished accountability to different institutions, which makes it much harder to make political change on this single government level. The neoliberal reforms have changed the scope and the opportunity for political agency with Generation Z. And therefore, I think it's not a surprise that the protests and the dissent of Gen Z are changing. I do think there is a distinct point that there are changing narratives within the protests, that we're no longer as hopeful as previous generations, but plagued by a much more pessimistic outlook. We are driven not by hope and for the future or things for getting better, but by guilt and fear, and we just simply want to prevent collapse. And I quickly want to just note on why I think this is the case. Gen Z have grown up and it's been seen that this has kind of shaped the way they see politics and see their future in an age of economic uncertainty, increasing risk, environmental destruction, and narratives of disaster. This, alongside the online environment which provokes kind of the worst case scenario and evokes provocative performity in our generation, has kind of created this hyperbolic and kind of tentative issue about what to do and how to kind of get around it. I think that this kind of has heightened this kind of sporadic movement and kind of uncertainty and kind of a collective sense of political agency and a fundamental loss of trust and belief in the formal political protests. This was seen in America in 2014. Jean Twenge, which I know is not how you say it, said that only 21% of Americans had a great deal of confidence in the political institutions to make changes. And this is lowest since 1972. And in the UK this year, the IPOS said, basically, their statistical analysis said only about 37 to 40% of Gen Z actually voted. And although this doesn't necessarily respond to dissent as such, I'm just trying to really make it clear that the reason that Gen Z's protest is changing is not because we have less of an opinion than previous generations, but actually how we dissent and how we enact political change is much less clear than it was before.
Okay, thank you very much. Ralph.
Am I audible? Well, I was born in 1996, so I'm in this generational no man's land where I'm neither quite a millennial, but I'm not really a Zoomer or Gen Z. So I might be the oldest person on this panel, so that's a very
I'll leave you to that. Yeah.
interesting position.
On the panel.
When thinking about this question, I found myself contemplating how in our culture we don't really have, I don't think, a good word or label for the person who aspires to try to think freely and think for themselves. Often if you have the nerve to oppose a consensus, a popular wisdom, or a trite orthodoxy, you risk being branded with a number of expressions. Contrarian, also common, gadfly, maverick, rebel, loose cannon, angry young man, iconoclast. You're someone who thinks outside the box. These expressions are slightly affectionate and thus at the same time a little bit condescending, as though society was a benign family that tolerates and even admires the eccentricity exhibited by its black sheep. You could even say there is such a thing as a contained opposition in society where a certain, even considerable amount of dissent is permitted by the political order for the purpose of social pacification and political legitimation, where dissidents can satisfy their rebellious urges without meaningfully challenging their rulers or transforming society. Let the youth burn themselves out before they go back to the simple established ideologies that deal with the chaos of reality. This is what Slavoj Žižek called inherent transgression, where society, even or the political order, thrives even on a certain amount of transgression that paradoxically affirm this order itself. However, if you stray too far from the periphery of this box, you risk being associated with less affectionate and less tolerant labels: fanatic, extremist, malcontent, subversive, some other words with an ist attached on the end, words with a far and a dash at the beginning. Many people find it really difficult to find the courage to oppose a consensus. Deep inside have grave doubts about. If you're in a minority of one against the majority, you tend to think that you're in the wrong and the majority is right. We're social creatures after all. We don't want to be isolated. It's very easy to take refuge in the security of a consensus or in the majority because that is what you're supposed to think, not because you arrived at that position through the exercise of your own free mind. For example, it is now the consensus and the majority of people, certainly of my generation and younger, to think that the Iraq War, the most monumental foreign policy decision of this century, was wrong, immoral, and a crime. But I can guarantee you, many people will uphold this consensus simply because that's what you're supposed to think as a good person. No one wants to be on the same side as George Bush and Tony Blair. You know, John Stuart Mill in On Liberty said that even if all in a room were agreed on a proposition, it would be essential to give an ear to the person who dissented, lest people forget how to defend and justify their original position. To give a more contemporary and a bit of a sensitive example, the October 7th attacks were past the first year anniversary, commonly billed as the biggest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, and enacted with a fiendish barbarism that has rarely been seen since the Mongols. And say someone dissents from this and says, you know about this October 7th business? I don't really buy it. All that stuff about beheaded babies is balls. And doesn't the Israeli army have a so-called Hannibal doctrine to kill its own civilians to prevent the capture by hostile forces? Now, you may call this person a conspiracy theorist, even anti-Semitic. Maybe you might be right. But this person doesn't just have a right to speak, but their dissent deserves extra protection because what he has to say must have taken him some effort to come up with, might contain a grain of truth to it, and, but more crucially, challenges us to think how and why do we know what we already think we know, other than the fact that we've just been told this and never heard anything else. It's like that old question about how would you prove the earth is round to a flat earth society member, you know? I remember there's a book by Søren Kierkegaard, which has as its title the Latin expression, which Karl Marx affirmed as his favorite motto, which goes like, de omnibus dubitatum, which means all must be doubted. Being an oppositionist or out of step, someone who musters the courage to think for himself isn't meant to be easy. There's always a risk that you will incur a cost from it. In such a scenario, one can actually earn the honorific dissident, as opposed to merely claiming it for yourself as a form of branding because of mere disagreement. But you will at least be able to have a life and not just a job and a career. Don't mistake this aspiration for being on the contrary for its own sake. That is just the path to snobbery. The point is not what you think per se, but how you think. This is really what it means to be a radical, to go by the route, or a free thinker. And I'm reminded of a piece by one of my favourite boomer writers, Christopher Hitchens, in Letters to a Young Contrarian, where he described this high ambition better than I could, that one should strive to combine the maximum of impatience with the maximum of scepticism, the maximum of hatred of injustice and irrationality with the maximum of ironic self-criticism. And I can't think of any better piece of advice for Gen Z than that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so lots of very interesting, thoughtful introductions. I think we should dig into some of what you've said. Think about things like the courage and more debate, and I thought your idea of Gen Z actually needing to transcend Gen Z was very interesting, actually, and new politics and so on and so forth. So it's really over to you now to ask any questions you want, put any points that you want. Don't feel the need to be confined to questions. And where shall I start? I was going to start with someone. Oh, I might as well start in the front.
Hi, thank you. That was fantastic. Best panel I've seen today so far. I think there are two aspects to dissent, if you want to call it that. One is having an opinion, and that may be a valid opinion or invalid. You might not have the right data, or you might not have the right information. But there's what you think, and that's what we do when we go into the voting booth and we put a cross against whoever we want to be in power. And the other is trying to get other people to think that way. And today we do a lot of trying to get other people to think that way if we have the courage. But there is no mechanism like the voting booth that says, well, if I don't agree with foreign policy on Israel, I'm going to state that, it will be recorded, it goes into the machine, and it becomes part of the overall, this is what people think. And that's what, I'm actually working on a solution to this at the moment. So I'm trying to build one of these. So it's really interesting to hear your view on that in terms of whether we need to sort of disaggregate our current political system, which currently young people are the most underrepresented people in Parliament. I mean, there would be 180 people under the age of 30 in Parliament if it was representative. And there are less than 10. So there isn't a political mechanism to actually make change. And most young people don't join political parties. In fact, only 2% of the population in this country are members of a political party. So I'll wrap up. So for me, the mathematics of democracy is awful for all of us. It's particularly bad for young people. And I'd just be interested to get your sense of if there was a private way of saying this is what I want or don't want, and that gets fed into a machine that says, okay, well, this is what everyone thinks. Yeah. Would that solve a lot of the problems?
Okay. I mean, I do think that there is a question there as to whether we want to reduce political representation to people who are exactly the same.
My question is, should there be a system that does that?
Yes, but I don't think it necessarily resolves the question of dissent just because someone is the same age as us as a mechanism of representation.
No, it's not about age, it's for everyone.
Yeah, but that was the comments you made about the age representation. But anyway, I'm going to go and take some questions. Yes.
I just say there was kind of elements of defensiveness in kind of defending Gen Z. Not Gen Z, but I don't know anyone who thinks that Gen Z were created for who they are or the world they live in. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is just there were a number of comments, and I just wonder what the panel thinks about the importance of feeling and the increased importance of feeling, not upsetting someone. To a certain degree, dissent is going to require some people to be challenged, offended, their ideas are going to be challenged, and to me that's what I see as the biggest shift, and that's what I hear about when I talk to young people.
Yeah, good question. Yes.
Question. This really goes out to the whole panel because I'm just curious. Like when I saw this talk, how to become a dissenter, naturally, I'm sure I'm not the only one in here. The word woke comes to mind, and woke is this sort of neologism. We have a lot of neologisms, given that you guys are given that a lot of us are Gen Zers in here, like Riz and Len, and all these other words, but then woke is one that sort of made its way into the wider public lexicon. I want to know, to each of the panel, what do you understand from that word? So I'll give you an example. Like for me, it's kind of shifted. It used to mean, and because this ties it back in with the subject of this talk, it used to mean somebody with, let's say, progressive values, who maybe takes them to an extreme. But now, to me, woke refers to someone's attitude to those who dissent from their worldview. Like I would argue that there is now such a thing as a woke right as well as a woke left. So I'm curious to know from the panel, what do you mean? I'm curious if there's a consensus among the panel of what do you understand by the word woke?
Okay, right at the back.
So I'm a member of Generation X, section Germany, I think what's really important in that discussion is that on one hand, to be really historic specific about the differences between the situations that we faced when I was like 25 and the situations you do. But on the other hand, being careful not to overestimate the differences. Because I remember hundreds of years ago when I was young, we were basically confronted with quite similar prejudices as you were. We were the generation after the glorious '68 revolutionaries. We were called consumist, relatively unpolitical and all that stuff. So it's a kind of similar rejections. At the same time, when you entered politics, the discussions you had and the conflicts you had turned out to be very emotionalized and very personalized as well. So I came from the radical anti-fascist German left. And when I joined in like people who were in favor of free speech, and I went out with that, that meant that, for example, that I lost my complete friends, everyone. So I was completely isolated. The people I used to hang out with in the past, they would change the side of the street, and they would really completely ignore me. So it's again, also at that time, things turned out to become really very emotionalized and also very very bad and personalized as well. So in many ways you can experience you experience probably the same thing as we did in the past, but obviously there are also changes. But I think it's quite useful to look at the historical tablets. And just first final point, you all should know the film Life of Brian. There's that fantastic scene where the crowd gathers in front of his window, and he tries to, well, you don't have to follow me, you don't even know me, we are all individuals, right? And then the crowd chants all of the same, yes, we are all individuals. And then, and you're all completely different, yeah? Yes, we are all completely different. And there's one guy saying, well, I'm not. No, I'm not. So, this film is like hundreds of years old, but still is very relevant today. So you can also look at past things and draw conclusions from that, and shouldn't get carried away by changes, but also look at similarities and what we can learn from each other, which is also important for the dialogue between generations.
Okay, I'm going to say one more here, then I'm going to come back to the panel for a few thoughts and answers, then I'm going to come to a cluster of hands up there. So, yes.
Emma, I thought your observation about the difference between 1968 and today was very interesting. And you said that the difference was that in 1968 their target was the government, and now it was their institution, their educational institution. And you said that it was the responsibility of the government, that they somehow delegated responsibility down to those institutions at some point in between those two moments. I wanted to push you on that and see what you meant by it. But then also to ponder whether it's a result of marketisation in higher education. Because one thing that really struck me when I was at university quite a long time ago was that the language was all highly consumerised. When they were protesting against Israel, the actions of Israel in Palestine, they would say things that like, it's not good enough for Sussex to continue to support these actions, and it's not good, this isn't good enough. They use the language of the market to talk about their educational experience in a way which perhaps wasn't true in 1968, when perhaps those universities were genuine communities of intellectuals in a way which perhaps is less true today. And then Ralph, just quickly, I think I agree with almost everything you said, but I have found myself recently more interested in the idea of how truth is, to some extent, social. Because if everyone is a dissenter, then we have no basis for truth at all. It is a process of agreement. And so your remarks about October the 7th, I thought were interesting. Do you think, or would you agree that they're, bearing in mind what you say about the importance of protecting dissent around particular topics, which I totally agree with, there is also a line though, isn't there, where doubt and scepticism inevitably becomes an expression of one's individual prejudice, particularly in the context of Israel and previously in the context of the Holocaust. One really interesting question to think about is how people have historically proven the Holocaust. It's a difficult thing to do, and it's a project that's taken a long time to formulate. And today they're facing the same questions around what happened on October the 7th, because there comes a point where you're insisting to Jewish women, show us the evidence you were raped, you know. And to me, that speaks to not necessarily positive intellectual dissent, the kind you're talking about, but more quite an antisocial rejection of any possibility of truth. So where do you think that line sits?
Okay, so lots of interesting questions. We've got the dissenting machine, we've got offence, we've got the woke right and what's the meaning of woke, we've got emotionalism. So where am I going to start? How about you, Vinny?
Okay.
You can't answer everything.
Yeah, no, of course. No, I've got kind of 2 points I want to pick up on.
90 seconds of thoughts or something.
Okay, so first on, someone in the second question said Gen Z aren't responsible. And that might be true, but the problem is this is the problem we've got. Like, we've inherited the problem. So I think and I'm not necessarily saying you're saying this, but I think to kind of be like, oh, well, it's not our fault. But we've got to deal with the consequences. And I also agree, though, with the point that you make about the importance of kind of safetyism. I really think this is pervading in our culture. And this is the kind of critical theory argument for regulating free speech, is people might get hurt. But as you've exactly said, in order to, this is quoting Jordan Peterson, in order to think you have to risk being offensive. Like, just speak, I'm risking being offensive. So am I just going to stop speaking altogether? Like, no, there are consequences of arbitrarily regulating free speech. And I think that's what these people who are trying to regulate free speech don't understand. On Ben's question about woke, what does woke mean? Well, I generally agree, and I personally hate the word, but there's no other way to describe these sorts of phenomena going on. So I'd say generally it's to do with identity, and it's to do with a kind of disgust sensitivity of like, oh, you know, you guys, you evil kind of patriarchal kind of capital. It's a sense of disgust, like it's a sense of virtue, and I really think that's kind of taking over. Having said that, you're completely right about the woke right, and that's something I wonder. I'm like, am I on the kind of woke right? I don't like to think I am, but then I don't like wokeness. So it's really hard, I think, for all of us, who are kind of interested in these things to think about what we're doing, if we're kind of on the right side of history as well. That's a whole other thing. But yeah, those are my thoughts, if they make any sense. So.
Emma, do you want to take on the challenge of the politics that was thrown at you, and is it marketisation?
Yeah, so I have a couple of things, I'll start with that one. And I do think that what I was arguing is that the reason that especially universities is marketisation, but actually going along with what I was saying about the decline of political agency, something I was kind of hesitant to mention, but what I was reading about online is that actually what Gen Z have realised is while they've got a kind of declining interest in formal political institutions and don't see agency in that way, they've realised the amount of power they have as consumers because of this intense commercialisation of society. So it's, instead of trying to fight a fight that they're not going to win, it's like they use that power to try and hold businesses to account, to try and change universities. And even with the environment, you see it in the kind of consumerization of the environment debate. It's not really, they've kind of left behind just focusing on government policy and instead trying to change consumer behaviour in their politics. Also, I wanted to quickly go back to what do you mean by woke? Because I was thinking about this again in relation to the protests in 1968. I'm like, well, if they were also trying to fight for racial equality, fight against war, against nuclear power, like what makes us woke? And I do think it is that kind of taking things personally and trying to kind of make your whole self about the politics, and therefore it becoming this kind of intense fight between people and what they're feeling rather than the political argument that they're having. And I think that is what makes it a woke culture rather than the actual side of the argument that you're having.
Sam, the importance of feeling and not being offended and stuff like that, was that kind of what prompted your courage point, or is that political courage in a more political sense?
Yes, it is. That's exactly what I have in mind when I talk about courage. And if I may, I'll sort of conscript you, I think, and the point about feeling to address the challenge to define woke. Unlike Vinay, I actually do like the word woke. I think it does convey, as you say, in the absence of any real alternative, it does convey something fairly distinct and recognisable. And what is it? I mean, I don't think it's a political ideology. Woke doesn't mean progressive, it doesn't mean left-wing, or else it might be used to describe, say, the protests in 1968 to some degree. I think what woke is it's a rhetorical device. It's a type of rhetoric whose central insight, I think, is basically that sometimes it pays to be a wet wipe. It's that, it's like you can get the upper hand in an argument, particularly an argument with authority figures, if you are very oversensitive, if you make repeated reference to your feelings. And I think, I spoke about a broader crisis of courage and integrity in modern life, and I think I absolutely see woke, so to speak, as a manifestation of that. That is, I think, novel in our own times.
Tyler, pick up on anything you want, but there's the dissenting machine question still on the table.
Yeah, with your dissenting machine, I'm not quite sure how it works. Does it not? I feel like it's trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, because people have always expressed the disagreement. It's not like you vote and then you go, oh, well, the other team's won, right, that's it now. I'm never going to talk about it ever again. People have always kind of dissented against, something that they've lost. So I'm not quite sure what problem it's trying to solve.
It's measuring on each issue what people actually want or don't want. So we have, that machine doesn't exist today. I mean, obviously we do market research occasionally.
Yeah, but we can't go into the dissenting machine again, because...
No, I was just explaining what it was.
No, of course. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else you want to pick up?
The only other thing is the definition of woke. I think it's quite telling that nobody's actually given a definition. We've just given vague sentiments of, oh, well, this is woke, this isn't woke. That's the, I've seen quite a few interviews where people have been stumped, what's woke? I don't know. I think that just shows that it's not a thing, Were the Catholic Church woke when they censored Galileo? I don't know.
Yes.
They were? Okay. So it's just people, being emotional then?
We're historically jumping around.
I don't think they presented their argument in a woke in the woke mode of rhetoric.
Okay.
Ralph, there was a direct challenge to you from Luke, which I'm sure you want to take on.
Yeah. I think the essence of your question is, when does skepticism become denialism? Like denialism in the face of plain facts in front of you. And this is, obviously I believe in truth, facts, I'm not a relativist or, a Nietzschean perspectivist, where there are different perspectives that you have to consider. But to arrive at truth, it does require a bit of conflict, right? That's the dialectic between different arguments to arrive at the truth of a matter. And when I think, for certain things like evolution, there was a titanic intellectual battle over that, and one side won, the other side lost. And I think, on October 7th, that we can pretty much say as factually certain that a lot of atrocities were committed, and they're independently verified, and a lot of people go through, are using non sequiturs, that because this little aspect wasn't what the Israeli government said was happening, therefore everything else, and we know what that is. So Yeah, I agree with you, in essence. As for the question, what do I mean by woke? This is one of the reasons why I never really use the word woke. It's one of those things that you can't give a clinical definition, but you know it when you see it. But if I was to give a description of it, it's, if you will, the degeneration of the 60s idea of the personal is political. You know, that's, if you will, the roots of woke or identity politics come from that generation, and it's been advanced to a very unhinged and even parodic level. So that's how I would describe woke if I had to really. And this comes to the point about the difference between the 60s and this generation. But mustn't forget that what we call neoliberalism is the form of capitalism that the new left created. So the dissenters of the 1960s became the ruling class. Let's not forget that.
Okay, right, the hands are up, the challenges are in.
Dissenters.
Right, we're going to zip through sort of around this way, then come back to the panel, and then for anybody that I miss, I'll come back out again as well. So why don't we start with you, and then we'll go around this row there.
Well, I thank you very much, first of all. It was very interesting so far. And I think that the life of a dissenter has never been an easy life. From Galileo throughout the Enlightenment until our days, dissenters have to be courageous and they have to be able to stand out. And that's why we as a society should listen to them. However, I have another question for you. Is this, being a Gen X, like the gentleman, I'm wondering, what are your cultural references? What are your leading thinkers? For our generation, where the Peter Hitchens, the Salman Rushdies, the Toni Morrisons of our generation, those were leading cultural figures that informed a lot of our worldviews. We also challenged all of our views. I'm wondering, what are Gen Z's, Gen Z's cultural references?
Okay, yes.
Any personal tips from you about how you encourage not just dissent but disagreement amongst Gen Z? I'm faced with this problem all the time at work, and I need my colleagues to dissent and disagree, particularly with me, but with orthodoxy, and it's really hard. So any tips would be very
Okay, good. And then yes?
Yes. Please go ahead.
I feel like this is an idiotic take, but while what we consider woke beliefs, aren't these guys dissenters as well? So let's say, for example, pro-Palestinian, gender critical race theory. Pro-Palestinian, the government, this government, previous government, have both stated that they support Israel. The woke side disagrees with that. Gender critical, if you ask woke people, they'll tell you that they think the state is against them. Critical race theory, they say the same thing. So aren't the woke people dissenters? And Vinay and maybe the other panelists are the same with this. And to a certain extent, my experience at university, I often felt that I was standing up for the mainstream opinion rather than the dissenter's opinion. So I wanted to get, the panelists' opinions on that. So for instance, stand up for people saying, a man's a man, a female's a female, which has been the canon since God knows when.
Yes. Okay. So.
So I just had a question for you guys. Why do you think? I work in the media. Why do you think the impression, and you are everybody in this room is the target demographic for legacy media, and so why do you think this trope persists that to do this, in order to do this, they need to become, I don't want to use the word woke, but they need to be gender affirmative and move to the left? Why does your a grouping that dissents from that, why does that not have dissent? You're not seen as a desirable demographic. For example, I work for the BBC, when they want to target you, they will be gender affirmative, they will be left-wing, they will be rather childish sometimes. And, it's clear that the intellectual capacity of Gen Z is much greater than is assumed by legacy media. The other question was about, do you think there is a trope, I'm sure you all agree that there is such a thing as necessary and empirical truth, but do you think there is a perception that Gen Z, as a grouping, believes that truth is by consensus rather than necessary or empirical, than the description of things as they actually are? do you think there's a belief that a general belief in older, the media's run by middle-aged men basically, a lot older than you, and they all think you want something different than a lot of you actually want. And you have the power to change things by dissenting visibly.
Okay.
Does that
Right. So you there, then you, and then Bruno, then back to the panel, and then out for the people that I haven't taken. Yes.
Why do you think there's like so much stigmatisation? Because when like Gen Zs do dissent, there's often like this stigmatisation that we're too politically concerned, and there's often like this sort of generational divide where they might have these terms like you're woke, or the other terms like snowflakes, like we're too concerned with looking at like challenging topics. So we might challenge that people conflating sex and gender as the same thing, and then often the previous generations are saying that we are too like politically concerned with this. So I wonder what your take is on that.
To what? What was that last bit?
What your take is on that?
No, the bit before that. I meant.
The like generational divide.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
I think I appreciate I came in late, so this may have been discussed in the 20 minutes before, but I think I disagree with the idea that there is just a Gen Z or a Gen X. I think there are deeper characteristics that are more important, because a 21-year-old that went to Eton and grew up in the home counties has a very different outlook to, say, a state school kid from a working class community in Manchester, and I don't know whether that's something that's massively considered when talking about dissenting. What's your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a good question. I mean, Tyler had actually argued that Gen Z needs to transcend the sense of itself as a means of dissent. Yes?
I guess what I'm curious about is the panel's thoughts more on social media and its effects on dissentism. Is it gradually sort of diminishing any sizable recognition within our generation of the impending importance of dissentism? Also, I mean, without dissentism, how does humanity possibly progress? If you look at historical philosophers, I mean, without them, humanity's progression, it simply wouldn't occur, which is actually hugely dangerous. I mean, if society's just at a standstill, that's a major concern. Do you think social media has anything to do with that in the current state?
Okay, good. And Bruno?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really lucky because when I left school at 16, I was suddenly in a world where most of the people who were working, most of the people he worked with weren't your generation. So the conversations you had in the canteen, newspapers, or some people were into specific sport, or even music, but certainly ideas and politics were from people from different generations. People who fought in my day, people who fought in the Second World War, people who done all kinds of stuff that was different from you, and more important, more different, totally different from back to your parents as well. And I found that really, really liberating, because one of the things I actually found really stultifying about the time when I was a few weeks as a sixth former, was how crushingly orthodox, even in its rebelliousness, the debate of my contemporaries was. And suddenly, with coming into contact with other people, but as an equal, as someone younger, but someone in that workplace, trade union politics in those days as well, or political debate, where you meet them as equals, you meet a whole range of experiences. And I think that's one of the most important things about the pursuit of truth, or the pursuit of argument over the path to get to the truth. And we never arrive there, by the way. That's the whole point. The pursuit of truth, the struggle, the argument to find it, is an end in itself. I mean, that's really, really important. It's an end in itself. Democracy, free speech, freedom are ends in themselves. That's actually why they're so important. They're not a means. They're not a means to an end. So I think the really interesting thing is, how do you, and I think this is what some of the struggle of debate is, how do you break out of generational ghettos, silos, people call them nowadays. That can be one of the problems of social media, because the social media is just a very, 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 very big sixth form common room. And how do you speak to other people who aren't like you? I mean, this is the whole power, isn't it, of speech, the whole power of ideas the whole power of argument is you talk to people who aren't like you, and through that conversation, through that argument, through the pursuit of a truth, particularly the people who disagree with you quite often, you yourself become somebody else. And I remember once, years ago, just the last point, and I was a sort of young man, I used to call ourselves militants in those days, not with a capital M with an affiliation, we used to call ourselves militants. And I was complaining to this old guy, and I was saying it's really difficult. How do I have a conversation with people at work? Because, you know, it's not like they allocate any time for discussion with your colleagues about socialism and world revolution at work, because bosses have never done that, bastards. And he said, look, it's really simple, right? When everyone's together, you can just pull out a chair, stand on the chair, and you talk to people. And if you do it, you'll find it's okay. And you know what? I did do it, and it was okay. And I think that's a real, important insight. But I think the real battle that people have today, I think, is much more difficult. Not because of your generation, not because of what you are like, but because the world has moved on, the world has changed in some negative aspects, is to find that way of breaking out of being Generation Z, of breaking out and talking to other people who are young. I think that's the key challenge.
Okay, let's start up at this end of the table this time. Tyler, do you want to, anything that you want to respond to in that? And I'm going to sort of start out here next time and work my way over.
An awful lot of questions.
You don't have to pick up on anything, just give us 90 seconds of thoughts on one or two things.
Okay, so are Gen Z stigmatized? I mean, the reason I came up with all those historical examples was to show that younger generations have always been stigmatized. It's, stories all this time. Who are the current intellectuals, someone asked. I don't know. I think there's a broad array of people on Twitter, writers, Slavoj Žižek was quoted. I think, young people just kind of, like any generation, take a mishmash of whatever fits the current mood, the current moment, and kind of absorb it. I mean, some people would argue, Jordan Peterson, for example, is the current intellectual. I would query that. And I guess the last point on social media, so I did try and pick up on that. So social media can be great, can be terrible. If you just sat in a sort of Twitter space with 10 people who agree with you, is that advancing the conversation? I don't know. But, these are platforms which aren't designed for social engagement. They're designed to make money and advertise to you. So I think one of the best things that we could do as a generation is step outside and have real conversations like we're having now.
Ralph?
On social media, I think it has allowed people to market themselves as dissidents away from the mainstream, like Tucker Carlson. Like, you find this term, the dissident right, a lot. You find the likes of Tucker Carlson, who was once a bow-tied establishment, bucket conservative, and now he's like some insurgent right-winger. And but then what you find is that they just come up with establishing orthodoxies themselves, or trying to funnel what was once the orthodoxy as the past as the new insurgent idea. And I heard the expression woke right being used. Well, once upon a time we just called them fascists.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
Sam, anything that someone needs to take on the truth question that came up again. I don't know if that's you, but
which truth question?
About the consensus.
Oh yes, I mean, yeah. Does Gen Z have a theory of truth, so to speak, that is more about consensus than what we might consider sort of objective fact? Very possibly. I mean, it's a really interesting thought. I think, all people are, very many people are naturally conformist, right? So I don't think this is necessarily an affliction unique to Gen Z, and most people go through their lives assuming that what the majority of the people around them believe is true. And there are good reasons for this. We can't critically, we can't turn a critical eye to everything in our lives, and that this is a general and useful heuristic. And I think this is related actually to Omar's question of whether woke really, whether the woke students are the real dissenters. I mean, in some ways there's a point to it, right? But in others they are conformists. Usually, in the settings they're in, usually they are not really incurring risks. Maybe a pro-Palestine activist, for example, is incurring a risk when he or she gets into brawls with pro-Israel demonstrators, but this doesn't happen very often. And usually, what they're doing is putting up a poster in on the humanities building in their university, where probably the vast majority of people who walk past it either agree with it wholeheartedly or don't really care, but don't object to it particularly. So it's obviously sort of context dependent. And finally, I was interested in this point about why sort of legacy media targets young people in a sort of woke way. And I suppose, the first thought that comes to my mind is, who are they hiring? And is it possible that the people who work for these organisations who are young, I think this is the most likely explanation, that those people really do buy wholeheartedly into these sorts of ideas, or at least to a greater extent than perhaps the norm.
Vinay, I wanted to just to ask you, actually the thing that Sam just said there about people often today just walk past things with a shrug of the shoulders and it's kind of like, I don't really whatever, basically. And is that, rather than the description of everything being, grippingly conformist and everybody just kind of conforming with everything in a kind of scared to put their hand up and say something different, is the condition for a dissenter to deal with today one of the shrug of the shoulders situation? And if it is, then how is it that what does that mean for the question of dissent?
Can you repeat the last bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, we often have thought historically about the question of dissent being that you really have to fight against a society that's got a conservative grip.
Sure. That's it's funny because like a critical theorist would say, well, me existing is a kind of act of resistance, because again they talk a lot about resistance politics and kind of faith. So I guess you could say by ignoring if this is what you're leading to, by ignoring the kind of Gaza poster, or now this week at Warwick it's the Tommy Robinson stuff, it's like every week it changes, it's kind of that. So I think you could say so, but I think the real solution is, I think this game is a very like kind of cop-out kind of game. I just don't think it's not really doing anything. It's not really dissenting. I would say it's just kind of like ignoring or kind of abandoning the sort of situation. Also, I just wanted to pick up on the point about kind of what Tyler was saying, but also other people. Someone was saying about Gen X and Gen Z. They need to talk to each other, which that would be really nice. But I do worry that Gen Z, the kind of, and again, I get Omar's point, the kind of the woke are the real dissenters, which you could say is true, but those people dissent, but then they don't want to debate with anyone else, broadly speaking. And therefore, when it's coming to the workplace, when it's coming to education, when it's coming to publishing, the FSU, we did an event on Monday about publishing, we're seeing that the people who are kind of young and kind of have these values are kind of enforcing them on the higher powers that be, and because professors, publishers are scared because, again, these issues are very sensitive. They weaponize compassion. People are kind of scared, and therefore I am kind of a bit cynical, actually. Yes, we should talk. Obviously, that's what we're doing today. But I think the current kind of woke generation, we're in a bit of a different experiment and a different type. That's what I would say.
Okay, Emma, quick response. Then I want to come out to the audience again for one last round of questions.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to look a bit at what you asked about truth, and whether Gen Z believe that there is kind of maybe more objective truth. And I wanted to kind of throw a curveball out there, and without sounding really Foucauldian, kind of argue that for a long time there was this kind of one dogmatic truth created by the older kind of power, older generations' knowledge, and that actually for a long time dissenting and fighting for liberation was questioning that truth and trying to kind of question what was right and what could be right, and kind of create a different kind of collective truth. And therefore I think there is a danger with especially with what we've spoken about of just labelling like the progressive views as woke and being like, oh, they can't handle it, or they haven't thought about it, they haven't discussed it. Is that just a kind of reiteration of trying to enforce what was true without wanting to discuss with younger generations what could be true?
Okay, so going to start with you, work our way down here and over. Yes.
Yes.
You have to be reasonably quick.
Sure. Why is the Gen Z not dissent in their own interests? Like, where is the campaign to build masses of houses on the green belt? Where is the campaign? Why are they more likely to march against the raising of the pension age than for it? In the NHS, why is it a scandal that an old man waits 6 months for a knee operation, but not that a young woman waits 5 years for a rape trial and so on? Where's the dissent against the government in your interests?
Yeah, you could even say why are they out on the environmentalist march that stops them building the homes in the first place? Yes, Jenny.
Yeah, just thinking about your trust and depoliticisation. I was wondering about the panel's thought on the flip side, which is consent, because there's a question mark, I think, over how strong is the cultural conformism. Social media is very strong, right? If you work in a university, it can seem very strong. Beneath that, it seems that actually society is very fractious and fragmented, and that's really the problem that we are. To go back to the point over there, in a way, we are all dissenters now. And if you're a trans activist, for example, you think you are taking a risk, right? I don't think we might, I might look and think, well, that's sort of safe ground, but it isn't for the person who's arguing it. So, I think. Well, it's a question about that, and isn't that what this moment has in common with the 60s? Because that's what the 68ers were doing as well. They were a product of that time where consensus was actually falling apart. And even though it was a tiny, tiny proportion of kids at the forefront of the counterculture, it was that wider zeitgeist of, kind of cultural fragmentation. So.
Yes, and even you could take it further, the analogy into it's not like we're fighting back just now against people who are desperate to conserve history. Exactly. In fact, history is the worst thing you can possibly argue for today. Yes.
Yeah, so it's really great panel, really interesting. I suppose just something I was thinking about while I was listening to is that we're very much focusing on like very active sort of dissent and people standing out. The meme you mentioned, the guy standing out and saying what he thinks, but there's something that has been touched on a little bit, but there's this idea of a slightly more kind of passive form of dissent, possibly against the sort of very polarised world that we now live in. And I think that's something that I find very enlightening about a lot of Gen Zers that I meet, is that they're willing not only to have conversations, but actually to listen to the other side. Because I think the thing about woke, I find it tricky to define it, but it does seem that now it's very much a pejorative term that people use to sort of, cast aspersions on someone they disagree with, which is interesting because in a sort of very circular way, we sort of say that this group of people is woke and they're woke because they won't engage with anyone on the other side. Yet we're sort of excusing ourselves from engaging with them because they're woke. And so I think thinking about dissent in a passive way of actually listening to people, even if you sort of completely disagree with them, and it's not necessarily about, I know we're at the battle of ideas, but it's not necessarily about shouting at people, but trying to actually understand people and where they're coming from and whether that's a form of dissent. And then very quickly there's someone about...
No, Ryan, you can go on.
I just wanted to go back to something that Alastair mentioned at the start, which I don't think has fully been addressed since, which is this kind of right-wing wave across Europe, which has also affected the UK, Reform UK. And does this come from the same sort of impulse that directs Just Stop Oil protests and Palestine protests, albeit to different ends? Or is it a completely different phenomenon?
Okay. 1, 2, and is that it? Yes, so then it'll be back to you and I'll give you about a minute or so, whatever.
So, two very quick comments. One is, I wonder, for example, are you pro-Palestinian or are you pro-Israeli? And that sets up the fight. And I wonder if sometimes it would be better to reframe our discussions. Are you pro-human? And human rights, which then promotes different arguments and so on. My second point is when I think of dissent, I think of clash and people shouting at each other. And I do believe that we change each other most by telling stories. Stories are really powerful. and in particular stories of history. So I don't believe we can understand what's happening in the Holy Land without history or Ukraine, Russia. So my question would be, how can we encourage learning of history more?
Okay, final one.
Yeah, so I want to propose a challenge. So if we are to protect dissent, right, and thus promote free speech, to what extent would you guys go to protect free speech? Would you abolish libel and defamation law? Because, say that guy there, that Vinay guy, yeah? If you owned a business, then I would go on Twitter and I'd chat shit about him, yeah? Well, free speech allowed, but if I chat stuff about him online, and then the next day, his profit decreases drastically, and people start boycotting him. But then it turns out, what I said about him wasn't true. Should we protect that free speech? I think we should. And we should get rid of defamation and libel law. However, if Twitter bans someone off their platform, that should be allowed because they own that platform.
All right, good. So, 1 minute each. Are you up for that challenge? Yeah. Where should we start? Just go in the order that we went in. Who went first? Sam.
Okay, I'll start with why don't Gen Z dissent in their own interest? This is a really interesting question. I spent some time in France last year and was really astonished that students at the Sorbonne and so on were up in arms over over the rights of farmers to be subsidised by the government and artificially inflate the price of their own food. So this is something I saw up close. I do wonder though if Gen Z votes in their own interest. I mean, I think the last election in Britain, I mean, we've heard about the rise of reform and so on, but actually the vast majority of young people voted Labour. And whatever we think of Sir Keir's Labour Party, in a binary choice between Sir Keir's Labour and Sunak's Conservative Party, which was promising to send us all to national service and not build any housing and all the rest, I personally think we made the rational, self-interested choice. So maybe that is a form of dissent in our own interest in turfing out an anti-youth government for a marginally more pro-youth government. And very quickly, would I ban libel, defamation law? I really admire your free speech libertarian, your free speech libertarianism. Would I abolish these laws? No. I mean, I think most policies have agreed that they exist for good reason, but in Britain they are far too extreme, and I think we often sort of screw our faces up in confusion over free speech. But it seems to me that the Americans actually have a pretty good policy and have worked out how to do this in the First Amendment, which of course doesn't protect libel or defamation, but does make it very tricky to accuse someone of it and succeed in the courts.
Okay, Vinay?
I appreciate Ryan's kindness of trying to libel me. I agree with Sam. I think we should keep libel laws. We can talk more about that after. But I want to talk about this active and passive dissent. And it's kind of what I was saying in response to Alastair's question. Like, yes, there is passive dissent, there's listening. These are very important things. This is what I said in my opening remarks. We need to do these things, right? We need to have discussion and have debate, and that's what I'm trying to do in all that I'm doing. But there's something about agency. There's something about taking an active role in doing things. And I don't think it's good enough just saying, I'm listening. Yes, but you have to do something about it. And yes, it starts with listening, but it starts with taking action. And that might alleviate the problem or at least make it better for you. So I kind of end on a call to agency and free will.
Okay, thank you. Tyler?
One point I wanted to come back on was actually Vinay's point. You keep talking about critical theory arguments. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
It depends on the context,
but
we can talk about that after.
At this point.
We'll talk about that after.
You're using up your minute, Tyler.
Okay, how can we encourage people to learn history? I think stop trashing history. Maybe that would be a start. Maybe look for things that are a bit more affirmative and have more open dialogue. I think that would be the best place to start. What was the other point I'll come back on? Oh, you made the point that Gen Z are a lot more kind of open to conversations. I think some of them, yeah. But I mean, if I were to ask my conservative Jamaican grandmother what she thinks of people who disagree with the Bible, she's not very open-minded on that. And I think sometimes there's an obsession with young people online who are very vocal and maybe don't listen, and I think they take away too much of the conversation. And I think we need to go beyond generations and work across those divides.
Emma.
Yeah, I think I'll just come back on your question about whether there's something similar, really, with the kind of right-wing wave in Generation Z and kind of the action of Just Stop Oil, which, on the face of it, is kind of a weird parallel to draw, but to me it was kind of goes back to what I was originally saying, and it's that it seems that Gen Z there are things they're trying to do. So I think the conservative, or neoconservative backlash is this kind of attempt to take some form of control of what has been an increasingly deregulated and uncontrolled society, trying to create some more cohesive social norms and stuff, in a sense that we've grown up where there's been very little. And the same with Just Stop Oil. Okay, no one really, or very little people, kind of agree with what they did or the action that they had that had a positive effect, but it was this kind of sense that they had something they cared about and they tried within their means to make some change to it. And I do think it's interesting there's quite a negative reaction against both these movements after such a negative reaction to kind of the woke politics, because Gen Z seem to be criticised for doing nothing and then criticised for what they've done. And there is this sense that, well, maybe young people are just going to be criticised by older people because, they're trying to change things that maybe they don't want to be changed.
Okay, and finally, Ralph.
To your point, it reminds me of a Philip Pullman quote where he said, "Once upon a time is more powerful than thou shalt not." Secondly, society, or the reason why Gen Z is not spearheading any revolution is because of political degeneration and society is more pacified, even though it's more fractured. And as for the point of why people feel that they can't actually be the centers and ignite that conflict is nobody wants to be an awkward cuss, and people don't like conflict, they don't like antagonizing people, and they fear the reaction that they might ignite people. But I think this is also partly why sometimes the urge for dissent, or even the courage to it, is sometimes more innate as opposed to learned than we often think it is.
Okay. Give them a big round of applause. Lots of great questions, actually, and lots of brilliant answers. So thanks very much to my panel. If you want to know more about living freedom, then Felice over there will be all too eager to tell you more.
Yes.
There's a half-hour break.